from the News Channel 5 network. This is Open Line.
Welcome to Open Line. Glad you are with us tonight, Wednesday night. What is it, July 7th, 2021. Glad you're with us. We are talking about term limits. Should members of Congress have term limits? What are the chances that will ever even happen? Obviously, it's popular, but what are the chances it will happen? There's an organization, U.S. Term Limits, that wants to make it happen. There's a way you can go by states. There's a way that maybe we can get it could get through Congress. So we're going to talk about both sides of that. And we encourage you to call in tonight. Again, this is something that people traditionally have a lot of thoughts about. And so we encourage you to call in with your thoughts on term limits. Now, our guest is going to be Glenn Jacobs. He is the Knox County mayor. He is chair of Tennessee for Congressional Term Limits, which is sponsored again by U.S. Term Limits. We'll talk to him about what U.S. Term Limits, what that organization is, who is behind it. But he also, quite interestingly, is a three-time world champion in World Wrestling Entertainment as the infamous Kane. So that's kind of the elephant in the room. We'll talk less about that, but many of you may know him from that. He is now currently the mayor of Knox County. So he's going to join us via Zoom. But as we were coming on, Zoom kind of flaked out on us. So that's why I'm talking a little more than I normally do. I believe we are going to try and reestablish our connection with the Knox County mayor and then begin our discussion about term limits. Meanwhile, there's the number, 615-737-PLUS, 615-737-7587. Call in with your thoughts, comments on term limits. I can tell you that nationally, this is something that gets, it's very popular. It's popular among Democrats, it's popular among Republicans, and yet it has not happened. This U.S. term limits, they're trying to get it passed, obviously, across the entire country. They have state chairs, and that is what Glenn Jacobs is. He is the state chair for Tennessee for Congressional Term Limits. So, as we try to reestablish our connection with Zoom, maybe we'll take a break. What do you think? Should we take a break, Taylor? Oh, he's back. Okay, well then let's welcome the mayor of Knox County, Glenn Jacobs. Mayor, are you there?
Hey, Ben, don't you love this Zoom stuff?
Mayor, I don't love it. No, I do not love it. You just saw me tap dancing for a bit, but
I came in right as you were saying, let's go to a break. I'm like, oh, no, I'm here. Hold on a second.
There we go. Okay, well, good. Well, Mayor, I've introduced you maybe longer and better than almost any introduction you've had. I went through all kinds of things, and I covered in your history the fact that you were a World Wrestling Entertainment, a three-time world champion, infamous Kane. We're not going to talk about that, but I'm just throwing that out there that's the case. You are chair of Tennessee for Congressional Term Limits. So, and that's sponsored by U.S. Term Limits. What is U.S. Term Limits? How likely is it that we could ever have term limits?
Well, it's not very likely at all if Congress has their way, and that's what U.S. Term Limits is all about. It's an organization dedicated to imposing term limits on Congress through the use of an Article 5 convention, which is a convention of the states to propose an amendment to the United States Constitution. In this case, one that would term limit Congress.
So that's correct. There are a couple of ways this could happen, that we could actually have term limits, right? It could be passed by Congress, is that right? Or we can go through the states.
Sure.
And U.S. term limits is trying to do both, is that right? Are you trying both approaches?
No. So according to the Constitution, Article 5 of the Constitution allows two ways to amend the Constitution. One is that Congress could do it themselves by a 2/3 vote of both the Senate and the House. And then that legislation, that proposed amendment, would go to the states, which would have to be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures. The other way is that the states could do it themselves by 2/3 of the states calling for a specific amendment, a U.S. a term limit for Congress amendment. And it's the same thing. It would go, the convention of the states would send delegates, and they would look at the proposed amendment and the language, and then come to an agreement, send that proposed amendment back to the state legislatures for a 3/4 of the state's ratification. Congress could probably do this legislatively. No, they can't actually, because it is part of the Constitution that says what they're, that they have. There is no term limits. Now, the president, of course, has a term limit on what he can do. He can only serve twice. But up until now, Congress has chosen not to do that. And of course, they're not going to. I mean, Congress has no reason to term limit themselves. So I believe, as well as many other people and the folks at U.S. Term Limits, that the only way that we are ever going to get Congress term limited, which I do believe is important, is if the states pursue an Article 5 convention and make Congress term limit, basically. Not make them term limit themselves, but mandate a term limit on Congress.
Why are you so passionate about this? Why is this something that you're chair of Tennessee? You're running Knox County, but this is something else you're taking on. Why is this? Why are you passionate about it?
Our country is divided like never before, it seems. And there's one thing that we can all agree on, though, and that's Congress is broken. And there doesn't seem to be any way to fix it. I believe that this is a way to help begin fixing it. There's so much money and power involved at the federal level. And with Congress, again, instead of citizen legislatures, which we have in Tennessee at the state level, we have basically people go to Congress and that becomes their career. They become professional politicians who in some cases spend years, even decades in Congress. And it's very hard to remove them through the electoral process because 95% of Congress people are reelected, and 97% of the PAC money that goes into elections goes to incumbents. So the electoral process, unfortunately, we're not going to see success in getting new people in Congress. And I think that's important. You have new ideas. It also breaks up the power structure that in many cases becomes the enemy for all of us. So all of those things, I think that the term limits question is a way to kind of put Congress back in the box where it belongs.
We here in Davidson County have a fairly large Metro Council. It was determined that there would be term limits for our Metro Council. And that passed overwhelmingly. So now our Metro Council is term limited. That's a fairly new development. One of the things that you will hear some council members say is that with term limits, we lose some of that institutional knowledge. So we have a constant kind of changing of the guard. There are constant fresh faces and new ideas, but there is no institutional knowledge. And that in some cases hurts. So what do you say if that is a criticism? That if we're going to...
I don't believe that's true, and I don't believe that's true from my own experience. Here in Knox County, we also have term limits on elected officials. Everybody can serve 2 terms at county commission, our 3 offices, and the mayor. But there's still a lot of institutional knowledge among my staff, among people that have been here for many years. And I do rely on that very heavily. And at the federal government level, we see the same thing. There are people that have been in various departments for many years, and they stay there in lots of cases, no matter what the administration changes, Congress, and all those sort of things. So I do reject that. Because I've seen it here. And if you're good at your job, you're going to keep your job. Okay. And a lot of the institutional knowledge resides in Knox County. It resides in the department heads and the people within the departments. At the federal government, it's the same way. It resides not necessarily with the elected officials, but with the people that are working for them and for us as well.
We are so divided in so many ways, as you mentioned. And yet, if you ask many people if they like their congressman, the answer is yes. And so they'll rail on against Congress. Oftentimes, our individual Congress people will rail on against Congress. And yet, our individual Congress people keep getting reelected. Now, you're saying that's PAC money, that's this kind of thing. But that argument is, there is a term limit already set, and that is an election. So does this take some power away from people to keep someone in there who they like? What about that concern?
Sure, that's an argument. Again, when we're weighing the positives and negatives, for an incumbent has massive advantages when it comes to an election, just massive advantages. And it's the power, it's the money, it's the structure, it's everything. So I think that, and that's actually when I was talking with the U.S. term limits people, this is something that I brought up, is what is someone that does a good job, and I like them. I think it far outweighs, though, when we have new ideas, when we break that power structure. I think that far outweighs, having someone who is good stay there for a long period of time. And I think our country's in a lot of trouble if, we say out of however many hundreds of thousands of people that reside in a congressional district, if there's only one person in that district that can do a good job. Okay. I think that there's probably more than that. And this gives those people an opportunity to get in there with their ideas and hopefully make a difference themselves.
At the top of the show, you detailed there's a two-tier track, like you said, to amend the Constitution and make term limits the law of the land. It sounds like they both take a very long time. What is your most optimistic assessment of when we could actually have term limits?
It will be many years, I'm afraid, but we'll never get them if we don't start now. Last year in Tennessee, the State House passed the House Joint Resolution 8, which calls for Tennessee to join 4 other states, Florida, Alabama, West Virginia, and Missouri, with the call for term limits. There needs to be, will become hopefully the 5th state next year, if and when the Senate passes the House Joint Resolution 8 themselves, their version of that. But there still has to be 29 other states that join the call for convention, and then it has to go back to the states for ratification. So it is a process that will probably take years, but again, the longer that we wait to get it started, the longer it's going to be before it actually happens.
As chair of the Tennessee...
If I could say,
go ahead.
If I could say something too, and this is, amending the Constitution is not something that we should take lightly. So that process is there for a reason. So you want to make sure you get it right. So despite the fact that it is a heavy lift and it is a long time, that is by design, and I think that's important.
As chair of Tennessee for congressional term limits, you mentioned this resolution's passed in the House. It still must pass in the Senate. Do you think there's a problem, or do you feel like there's overwhelming support? What kind of support do you see in the Senate? And we're talking about the Tennessee Senate.
Sure. Yeah, it's the state Senate. Among the people of Tennessee, it's overwhelmingly popular. 78% of the folks here in Tennessee support term limits. I think there's a bit of an education process, no matter who you're talking with. But that's part all about, is ensuring their elected officials understand the process and understand why it's so important. So I think it stands a good chance in the Senate. I don't know the numbers myself because I haven't talked to all the senators. But here in Tennessee, Tennessee's in a really good spot compared to other states in the country because our General Assembly does a good job, frankly. So I am confident that the precise people in the Senate will come to an affirmative vote on this. We care about our country.
Now I get nervous because I'm seeing. I hope we don't lose your Zoom, but
no.
You can give us all your power here to keep the Zoom going. All right, we've done shows on wanting to change the Electoral College. There are groups out there that want to change the Electoral College. There's some states that predictably want to do that. There's some states that predictably don't want to do that. Maybe it's partisan. I'll let others kind of decide. But I think it's a factual statement. There's some that want to do it. There's some that don't. Are there some parts of the country that are more interested in term limits? Are there some states that are more likely to do it? What are you finding when you look at the map that needs to get you where you need to be?
I'm sure that it is more popular in some places than others, but I can just tell you anecdotally that I think that term limits, the idea of congressional term limits, enjoys overwhelming support. And we see it around the country. Here in Tennessee, the governor's term limited, as I said, in Knox County. I'm term limited in Nashville. Your elected officials are term limited. So it seems like it's pretty much everywhere, but at the federal government, at that level, that people would like to see. I think people want to see term limits because we've seen them everywhere else. And I'm sure that given the opportunity that most people would like to see term limits on Congress.
And a question I ask when guests come on. So you're sponsored by U.S. Term Limits. What is U.S. Term Limits, and who pays the bills for U.S. Term Limits?
U.S. Term Limits, again, it's an organization that's dedicated to the idea of promoting congressional term limits. It was started by a couple gentlemen, and from there has blossomed around the country. I believe it's a 501c4, which is a political nonprofit. So you have you have some individuals that pay the bills, as well as they solicit donations from people to keep the lights on.
And is it more Republican, Democrat? Is it partisan?
No, it's not. It's a nonpartisan effort.
All right. And again, how optimistic are you that we'll actually see this? And then I'm going to start taking calls. I'm going to open it up for calls.
Sure.
But your bottom line assessment, how optimistic are you that this is realistic?
I think it's realistic. Will it be 5 years? Probably. Will it be 10 years? It may be. Will it be longer than that? It certainly could be. Will it be next year? No. So I think that it will take a while, and it's a lot of effort as well. Once Tennessee signs on next year, that still leaves 29 other states to go. So that is a bit of a lift. But I think, too, what could happen along the way is perhaps the Congress sees which way the wind is blowing, and it'd be great if they decide to do this themselves as well. So we never can tell. I think the most important thing is that we start the process and get it in motion. And the sooner that we can do that, the sooner we see where the chips fall.
All right. I'm encouraging people to call in. Wow, I just lost myself on Zoom, but now I see myself. I'm encouraging people to call in there, 615-737-PLUS, 615-737-7587. What are your thoughts on term limits? What do you want to ask the Knox County mayor about term limits? So we'll take a break and come back and just start taking calls. So several lines open. Give us a call. Be back right after this.